So welcome everyone to Suffolk Archives, both to those in person here and to those who are online. It's lovely to see you all and be back in person. My name is Frankie Broom and I'm one of the trainee heritage assistants here at Suffolk Archives. I'm also joined by Chelsea just over here, who will be helping with any questions that anyone has, and Mandy Rawlins, who you might have seen wandering around just outside. Just a note before we start, if there is a fire in the unlikely event, if you'd like to make your way out of this door here and then out through the front door, and we'll gather at the back of the building. There's a big green sign. Also, this event is going to be live streamed to YouTube, and some of the talks are recorded, so you'll be able to watch at the end if you want to watch it again. We are honoured to be acting as a hub to the Out in the Past Festival of LGBT+ history for the second time after our debut last year. So to tell you a little bit more about Suffolk Archives itself, we look after Suffolk's archival history. We have approximately 9 miles of shelving here in our strong rooms, and on those shelves we care for around 94 million pieces of paper, with the oldest of those about 900 years old. We also have 3 branches under the Suffolk Archives umbrella: Ipswich, where some of you are here now, Bury St Edmunds and Lowestoft. So last year, in 2021, with the help of the National Heritage Lottery Fund, we opened our flagship Heritage and Archive Centre, The Hold, here on the Ipswich waterfront, in conjunction with Suffolk County Council and the University of Suffolk. The funding from the National Heritage Lottery Fund has also helped us in many projects aimed to engage more people than ever before with Suffolk's archival heritage. One of those projects was our Pride in Suffolk's Past project. That culminated in an exhibition that ran last year in 2021, which some of you may have seen. There was an unprecedented effort by volunteers here and community groups to collect and uncover more stories and experiences of Suffolk's LGBTQ+ community than ever before. This effort actually resulted in an award being given by the Archives and Records Association, who chose the Pride in Suffolk's Past project as joint winner of the Archive Volunteer Award, which recognises outstanding work by volunteers in an archives or records service setting. So I'm just going to show you a small video that was made last year as a taster to the exhibition that we ran. Whilst this exhibition is no longer here, there is an online display. So if you just head to our website, it'll be under the displays section, and you can go through everything that we found and had in our exhibition.
Pride in Suffolk's Past is a Sharing Suffolk Stories project funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, the University of Suffolk, Suffolk County Council and the Coastal Communities Fund. The project explores the hidden histories of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and gender non-conforming people in Suffolk's past. Due to legal and social repression, all too often these stories have gone untold. Through original documents found in Suffolk Archives collections and other local museums, these experiences can be shared for future generations to understand how things have changed and what work is still to be done. Alongside contributions shared by the LGBTQ+ community in Suffolk today and discussion pieces, Pride in Suffolk's Past presents the experiences of Suffolk residents throughout a period of significant change in attitudes towards sexuality and gender identity.
Discussing sexual orientation and gender identity requires sensitivity. Most of the historical figures featured lived during a time when identifying as LGBTQ+ was considered unacceptable or illegal. This means that we do not know how they identified. There may be evidence to suggest this, but we cannot state it with any certainty. But it's vital not to deny our LGBTQ+ community a sense of shared history. Many of the individuals featured are well-known public figures whose relationships were not explicitly declared, but equally were not concealed from view. Therefore, suggestions have been offered regarding their gender or sexual orientation, but we have avoided making any decisive statements. Ideas of what the archive collections should include have changed over time. Previously, materials collected in the archive often would have focused on people who were wealthy or white or powerful. This perception has changed, and Suffolk Archives now strives to include and uplift the stories of those who were previously marginalised. The LGBTQ+ stories from the Suffolk Archives collections lack diversity, and we acknowledge this is due to the marginalisation of Black, Caribbean, African, South Asian, Eastern Asian and Southeast Asian people's histories. Suffolk Archives are working to ensure our contemporary collecting is reflective of the diversity of Suffolk's LGBTQ+ population to ensure that everyone's experiences are recorded for future generations.
Everyone at Suffolk Archives is delighted to share these and many more LGBTQ+ stories past and present through a brand new free exhibition at the Hold in 2021. An original Pride in Suffolk's Past book has also been produced to ensure that these stories can continue to be shared with future generations.
So, as I've already mentioned, we at Suffolk Archives are acting as a hub for this year's Outing the Past Festival. And we now have a short video from Sue Sanders, co-founder of the LGBTQ+ History Month, who will tell you a little bit more about the History Month.
I want to welcome you to Outing the Past. My name is Sue Sanders. I'm the co-chair of Schools Out UK. Now, Outing the Past came out of the work that Schools Out does, and also, of course, we were the beginners of LGBT History Month. Now, Dr. Jeff Evans, who was a member of the committee, after 10 years of LGBT History Month, said, "We're losing the focus of history." And he came up with this idea of having a specific festival for LGBT history. And it has grown over the years. So we've got over 30 hubs this year. I'm so excited when I've looked at the offer. The full diversity of the presentations are amazing. And obviously Outing the Past is part of LGBT History Month. So you've got two websites to have a look at, the History Month website and the Outing the Past website. And also you've got a chance to buy a badge for LGBT History Month. Give yourself a lift, get yourself a badge. They're really important. They fund all the work that Schools Out does. Outing the Past, LGBT History Month, the classroom, all of that is done by unpaid volunteers, funded by the selling of our badges and lanyards. Have a great session. Look forward to seeing you in the future. Bye.
So, without further ado, let's move on to the main event this evening. We have a great selection of speakers for you today, including Rainer Schulze, who will be giving a talk on who was Suleika Aldini, followed by Alex Holmes, who will be talking about the secret lives of scientists. And finally, Muhammed will be giving a presentation on colonial contradictions, ethno-religious homophobia within intersectional British, Pakistani, non-heterosexual Muslim males communities. After each presentation, there will be a 10-minute Q&A session. Those of you who are watching the live stream, if you'd like to post any questions in the comments section, we will then ask these questions for you. And anyone here in person, you can raise your hand or make a gesture, and you can ask your questions here. So I would love to welcome Rainer Schulze, who has joined us here today to give his presentation on who was Suleika Aldini.
Thank you for inviting me to speak at the Suffolk Archives 2022 Outing the Past Festival. I don't know if any of you have ever found a bag with pieces of a jigsaw puzzle and you have then tried to put these pieces together, not knowing whether you actually had all the pieces and wondering what the final picture might be. This is kind of what happened to me and what I will be talking about today. How I tried to piece together a life lived in the shadows or in obscurity, where you have some pieces, but by no means all. And at the end of my talk, I hope we can discuss together whether we should actually do this, and if so, why, reconstruct the life of an ordinary person who during their lifetime assumed that no one was really interested in their life. A few years ago, when I was at the Schulze Museum, the LGBTQ+ museum and archives in Berlin, the archivist told me that they had a collection that he thought I might find interesting, because he knew that in addition to researching LGBTQ+ history, I'm also a Holocaust historian. I asked him to bring the materials down from the repository, and half an hour later, I found myself surrounded by 39 boxes of various sizes. More than 30 of these boxes contained photos, some in photo albums, but others, as it looked at first sight, thrown together in a pretty chaotic mess. 4 boxes were labeled personal documents, 1 box contained press cuttings, 1 box contained correspondence of various sorts, and 1 box was labeled interviews. This is how I met Suleika Aldini, a cabaret performer who had worked with various travesty shows, as they were called at the time, among them the well-known Chez Nous Theater in Berlin, and who had died in 2012, several years before I sat in front of these boxes. So who was Suleika Aldini? The first and very short answer is Suleika Aldini was legally Harry Walldorf, and in the German identity card and the passport, which were both included in one of the boxes, the date of birth was given as the 21st of April, 1937. The archivist told me that about 2 years before her death, Suleika had contacted the Schulze Museum because she wanted to hand over a few photographs to be kept in their archive after her death. Photos which showed her at the height of her career as a travesty or cabaret performer in the 1970s and 1980s. Beautiful, confident, glamorous. But when the then archivist, the predecessor of who I was talking to, visited her at home, he realized immediately that none of Suleika's more than 30 photo albums and none of the papers that she still had should end up in the rubbish. The Schulze Museum was keen to obtain all these materials as an important personal record of the travesty or trans community of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s in West Berlin, and the archivist hoped that Suleika would agree to explain everything so that there would be a proper record of her life. But Suleika was already seriously ill, and it quickly turned out that she was not really eager to talk about her life. The archivist from the Schulze Museum only managed to record 1 interview with her on tape and write down a few notes from memory following 3 other visits. The first thing I did was to listen to the 1 recorded interview in which she talked about some of the earliest photos that she had and explained what or whom they showed. About one of these photos, she said, "These are my foster mother and foster father. When I came back from the concentration camp, I joined a traveling circus and they took me in as a foster child. This is how I ended up at the circus." One can almost hear the archivist gulp, and he stopped Suleika in her flow. "I have to go back to what you just said. You came from, Suleika, from the East. I came back from a concentration camp." Suleika casually disclosed that she had been in a concentration camp as a gypsy, but when asked to talk a bit more about what had happened to her and her family, she steadfastly refused. I don't really want to talk about it. I could hardly believe what I had just heard. A German Sinto, for I was sure Suleika was most likely to come from a Sinti family, a German Sinto surviving Nazi persecution, who later ended up on the stage of various travesty theaters, and it seems no one knew much about it. I quickly realized, though, why no one knew much about it. Too much was unclear or not evidenced. Suleika mentioned Auschwitz at some point in the interview, although she did not say explicitly that it was Auschwitz where she had been. Auschwitz would indeed have been plausible. From early 1943 to August 1944, Auschwitz-Birkenau had a special subcamp for Sinti and Roma, the so-called Gypsy family camp, where Roma families, men, women, and children, mainly from German-speaking areas, were deported to. But the SS liquidated this subcamp in the night of the 2nd to the 3rd of August, 1944. All men capable of work had been transported to labor camps, and the remaining women, old people, and children were driven into the gas chambers during that night. It is all but impossible that the young lad that Suleika would have been at that time would have survived Auschwitz. Moreover, there is no trace of the name Waldorf in any of the surviving records of Auschwitz. But there is no trace of that name either in the surviving records of any of the other Nazi camps in the East where Sinti and Roma were deported to. So the question is Waldorf, the name in the passport, actually Suleika's birth name? Suleika said that the two people labeled Fati and Mutti, dad and mom, in her photo album were her foster parents. And this could mean that Waldorf was their family name and that the child survivor was given this surname after the war, in which case this name would of course not be on any Nazi list. Did her foster parents legally adopt Suleika? That is unclear. There's no birth certificate and no adoption certificate amongst the papers that Suleika left behind, just her passport and her German identity card with the name of Harry Waldorf. And another problem, the date of birth in Suleika's passport and in the identity card is the 21st of April, 1937. And that would have made the boy Harry, if that was what his name was at that time, between 5 and 7 years of age at the time of deportation. It is very unlikely that a child so young would have survived a concentration camp. But is this actually the correct date of birth? If the year of Suleika's birth was, let's say, 1930 or 1932, the lad could have been strong enough to be selected for slave labor, which would have given him a much better chance of survival. If Harry had returned from the East without any paperwork, and this was quite common, the German authorities would have accepted any date of birth that sounded plausible, especially if the foster parents confirmed this was likely to be the correct date. And yet another problem. Despite living in poverty in later life, Harry or Suleika never applied for compensation or a top-up to their pension, as was possible for Roma Holocaust survivors once they were finally recognized as victims of Nazi persecution in the 1980s and 1990s. Too late for many, but it would not have been too late for Suleika. However, there are reasons to believe that Suleika was indeed born into a German Sinti family and persecuted by the Nazis together with her immediate family for being a gypsy. And the reason for refusing to talk about her time in the concentration camp can, of course, be quite simply that she felt it was too painful to go back to this period of her childhood. Suleika mentioned in the interview members of her wider birth family, pointing them out on another of her early photos, gypsies. You can see that, can't you? And the first names of her relatives that she mentioned, such as Stachelo or Rugela, are typical first names of Sinti and Roma. And perhaps the most convincing point, but one that is based on no hard evidence whatsoever, it's more a gut feeling. Why would Suleika have made up this story when talking to the archivist, already seriously ill and close to death? What could she possibly have gained from making this story up? However, the fact remains that Suleika's origin are clouded in mystery, and I doubt that it will ever be possible to find answers to all of these questions. After the end of the war, the child, now 8, if the date of birth in the passport is correct, was taken in by a family who earned their living with a small traveling circus, and he traveled with them and their circus in the regions around Berlin. In the circus, Harry performed with horses as an equestrian or artistic horse rider, and he also worked with other animals, including snakes. The surviving documents show that money was always tight. In fact, for most of her life, Suleika seems to have lived on the brink of poverty, or actually in poverty, and she was always dependent on state aid to get by. At some point in the mid-1950s, Suleika began transitioning, but she only did the hormone treatment, injecting the hormones herself, which she got from God knows where. She never had the surgery, but then the operation was unaffordable to ordinary people in those days. And she began to perform in cabaret bars, taking on the name Suleika Aldini. In the late 1950s, Suleika had moved from Berlin to West Germany, to Hamburg, where she got her first contract as a travesty or cabaret performer. Initially, she continued working at fun fairs as well, but now only performed as a woman, both in the circus rink, but increasingly in the kind of fun fair shows which were very popular in West Germany in the 1950s and 1960s, with magicians, skimpily clad women, and freaks put on show. Suleika performed here as the woman without head, and a later contract showed her employed as an artist and female impersonator. Suleika loved her breasts and she loved showing them. And there are many private photos which show her casually and without any sexual undertone with bare breasts. She said at some point that she never had any problems at the fun fairs or in the circus because there everyone was an outsider, not part of mainstream society. In her words, if you showed that you could hold your own, you were quickly accepted and made part of that traveling community. The 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s were the most productive years of her life in terms of her performing on the cabaret stage, and they are also the best documented period of her life, both in photos and in written documents. Suleika developed different stage acts which she could perform either separately or in combination. An erotic song and dance show, she always sang live and did not use playback, a snake charming act, and a fire eating act, which was what she became best known for. She performed at some of the leading travesty or cabaret bars in Hamburg and in West Berlin, and in 1976, she joined Germany's oldest and best known cabaret theater, West Berlin's Chez Nous. Travesty shows were one of the few places where trans people and cross-dressers could be themselves and did not have to hide their gender expression or gender identity. They became quite popular with a wider public in West Germany from the 1960s, but they were very much based on the implicit understanding that the performers were just impersonating women, that behind the makeup, The big hair and the frocks were in fact real men. And this understanding made it safe for the wider public to watch these shows either on stage or later on television. It was a bit risque, but never crossing the line of questioning gender expression or gender identity. It was all a game and a bit of safe fun. It wasn't always all that easy and safe for the performers, though. Suleika recounted police raids, both in Hamburg and later in West Berlin, when the whole bar was cordoned off, everyone was taken to the police station, and during the police interviews, the wigs had to be taken off, the dresses, jewelry, and makeup had to be removed, and the police insisted that everyone went home dressed normally as men. Moreover, unless you were one of the few international superstars of the travesty scene, it was difficult to make ends meet just with these kinds of performances. And like so many others, even during her time with the Chez Nous Cabaret, Suleika had to apply regularly for unemployment benefits or social welfare support. Correspondence with benefit offices makes up the bulk of the paperwork that Suleika left behind. Suleika never became famous. She never became a celebrity, not even a minor one. She was always an also act, stuck in the second or even the third row, performing with some of the big names, but never quite in the limelight herself. However, all indications are that this period was, despite the constant money worries, overall a relatively stable period also in her private life. She struck up friendships with some of her fellow performers, and for 17 years she was in a relationship with a man. When talking shortly before her death about why this relationship ended, Suleika just said, "He drank too much, and then he was bisexual, and he met a real woman which turned him on, and then we split. I could not really blame him, could I?" Towards the end of the 1980s, life became more difficult. Her contract with Chez Nous ended in 1988. Suleika was now 50 years old, or perhaps even older if the date of birth in her passport was not correct. And new work contracts were harder to get. But more importantly, the whole travesty scene was changing. The kind of shows that these traditional travesty bars offered were no longer in demand with the wider public, who were looking for something more for their money, something more exciting, something more saucy or sexy. And then there was the AIDS crisis that impacted heavily on any such business, and many folded. And this is also when Suleika's life becomes again much less documented in the materials she left behind. Suleika tried to set herself up as a solo artist, but it seems that this never took off in any significant way. She was forced to do more casual work, small one-off performances in entertainment shows, New Year's Eve parties at gay pubs, and things like that. Suleika even tried to open her own pub, but had to close it down again after less than a year. Her last contract that I could find was as a fire eater for a weekly afternoon tea dance for pensioners, but her deteriorating health made it impossible to fulfill the contract. Her very last performance was in April 1996, when she performed at a fundraiser for people living with HIV/AIDS, and she did her fire show, for which she was best known, for a final time. After this fundraiser, Suleika gave up performing and sold up all her shows and her costumes to a younger colleague. In 1997, following her 60th birthday, Suleika applied for a state pension, which she received, but the amount was pitiful, and she tried to earn a bit on the side with some caretaker and gardening work and car boot sales. She ended all her connections from her cabaret time. There were no phone calls, no visitors. Her last years were characterized by old age, illness, and from all we know, loneliness. Suleika died on the 10th of October 2012. Only 2 people attended her funeral service at the cemetery in Neukölln: the archivist of the Schulze Museum and his deputy, the 2 people who had tried to recover Suleika's life history before her death. Suleika's landlord allowed them to take the last photos that were still on the walls in her flat and the few remaining papers, all of which are now kept in one of the 39 boxes in the archive. Suleika's life had gone almost full circle. Its beginnings are in obscurity, and her life ended in obscurity, or more correctly, forgotten by everyone. Perhaps that is what some of her former colleagues from the travesty shows said, even wanting to be forgotten. There are more questions than answers about Suleika's life, but one thing is clear: she was not an activist for LGBTQ+ rights. Travesty shows of the kind Suleika performed in were pretty much disconnected from the gay liberation struggles that were taking place in the 1970s. Suleika and basically all her fellow cabaret performers, many transgender like Suleika, were not part of these struggles and did not take up these issues in their shows. In that sense, they were not vanguard, and their shows silently sided with those who wanted to turn their eyes away from the changes that were beginning to take place in society as a whole, until the AIDS crisis led to a new and different kind of activism. Here, Suleika, like so many other of her colleagues from the stage, did become involved. Her last performance was at a fundraiser for people living with HIV/AIDS. However, I would argue that in her private life, Suleika was in some way progressive and perhaps even radical. She was not ashamed of who she was, and she did not hide it. Given the background she came from, this was quite remarkable. She lived her life as best as she could, openly, surprisingly openly, admiringly openly, pretty much in her own way and on her own terms. Suleika's life is an untold story which documents the unending struggles of a transgender person in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, when there were very few opportunities for an open life as transgender, and when daring to live one's life openly already in itself constituted a form of activism. But it also documents the joys this life held despite all the struggles. Transgender history before the 1990s is a hidden, or rather ignored, history. We don't know much about ordinary trans people who did not make the headlines, who were neither celebrities nor activists, but who just tried to live their lives as best as they could. And in the case of Suleika, made all the more poignant by the fact that she was, for all we know, a Roma child survivor of the Holocaust.
Thank you so much, Rainer. I just want to see, does anyone have any questions, either online or in person?
What is your theory around, I'm going to say, so I just wondered what your theory was, why Suleika sort of changed her birth date, because obviously do you think it was because she was older and thus wasn't able to get adopted, or what's the theory behind that?
I mean, all you can do is actually kind of try to find some plausible answers, and that would be my most plausible answer, that it was easier to both get at least foster parents placed in a foster family if you made yourself younger, but also what little child support was available in those days was probably available to someone who was as young as born in 1937, as 8 or 9 years old, but not available for those who were older. But that's, we don't know. I mean, it might be the correct year of birth. I just find it implausible. I find the other interpretation that she was actually older, but that the date in the passport was wrong, or was not the correct one. I find that more plausible, but it's guesswork. We don't know.
And why, because obviously there's a lot of those child survivor plans were released fairly recently. Why didn't she, do you think she didn't kind of go for them as like a form of topping up her pension? And, who knows?
Of course, again, there is no answer. But you will probably know that being LGBTQ plus within the Roma community is even more difficult than it is in any other community. LGBTQ plus Roma are ostracized, discriminated against by the Roma community, but they're also ostracized or discriminated against by the LGBTQ plus community. So again, one reason that I gave in the paper is that many survivors of the Holocaust find it difficult to return to the early childhood experiences of being in a camp, too painful, and they just don't want to talk about it. Others, of course, at old age do talk about it. People are very different. But I think with Suleika, I would probably argue that this multi-layered personality that she was, her Roma identity, still added to the problems of. And then there's the question, did she even know that she was able to apply for this kind of top-up? I don't know. Berlin is slightly more open, where she lived until her death then, in terms of advising people who apply for social welfare. They might have told her, but they might not have told her. That if they didn't know that she was of Roma origin, of course they wouldn't have told her.
Has any research been done with the people that perhaps she worked with, who she might have talked to?
That was what I was just about to start when the pandemic hit. I had talked to a number kind of on the phone, and we had agreed that we would meet. And that was in February 2020. And then came March 2020 and the pandemic hit. So I hope that most, if not all, survived, and that I can pick up on this in this year. There are some who knew her, of course, from the stage performances, but they all told me in the initial contact that I made that they didn't know anything about her past. They could only tell me something about the period when they worked on the stage together. Now, obviously, that's what they might say in a telephone call, and I'm always hoping that when you sit down face to face, something else will kind of come up that will trigger some memory. Oh, at that point she said whatever it was, and that you can still get a little piece of a puzzle. But they all kind of told me what we know is the period late 50s when she started into the 60s, 70s, and 80s. For all we know, he died of alcohol poisoning.
There's a question on YouTube, Rainer, from Alex. If you could personally ask Suleika any questions to find out more about her, what would they be?
That's a tough one. Let me just say what I've given this talk in various shapes and forms. This is probably the most condensed version I've given. But at some point, a suggestion was made from the audience that this is actually ideal for a theater performance. Because in a theater production, you don't have like a historian, has to work with evidence and cannot really go much away from the evidence. But in a theater performance, you can speculate much more, and you can have a conversation, that's why I'm saying this now, between the serious scholar who then asks questions of Suleika, fictitious Suleika, so to speak. But one of my questions would be, I don't know exactly how I would phrase it, but having done quite a bit in Roma history, I would try to see if I can uncover more about the Roma past. But that's exactly what you could play out on the stage, of course. That the Dawa historian could make certain statements that Suleika would then object to and say, no, 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 this wasn't the case. So it's something that still goes down through my head. Is there a way we can put this into some form of dramatic kind of performance?
Okay, well, thank you so much. If you'd just like to bear with us 1 or 2 seconds, our next speaker is joining us on Zoom, so we just need to swap everything over and
I disappear.
yes, thank you so much. So I'd like to welcome Alex Holmes, who will be giving a talk on the secret lives of scientists.
Hi, I'm Alex Holmes. I use she, her pronouns and identify as bisexual. For anyone who needs an audio description, I'm a white woman in my mid-20s. I have shoulder-length brown hair and a big smile on my face because I'm really excited to have the opportunity to give you this talk today. So I've been invited by Out in the Past to give a talk on the secret lives of scientists. Now, I've given this a pretty vague title because there was just so much I could talk about here. I'm hoping you'll leave this talk with an insight into how identity and science kind of interact with each other. So I'd like to start this by playing a game. How many famous LGBTQ+ people do you think you could name? No point keeping unless you're feeling particularly competitive. Now, in my case, I'm thinking of people like Freddie Mercury, Elton John, Oscar Wilde, Elliot Page, kind of definitely pop culture references. Be really interesting to know who you're thinking of. Now, a follow-up question. How many famous scientists do you think you could name? Maybe you're thinking of Albert Einstein, Stephen Hawking, Marie Curie, or Katherine Johnson? Let's narrow things down a bit. Where do these names overlap? It's a bit of a trickier question, so I'll give you a moment to think. Now, I'll revisit some potential answers later in my talk, but for now, I want to give you a question to kind of keep in mind throughout the rest of me talking. Why might there be a lack of openly LGBTQ+ scientists? Let's get into it. So let's talk about the science of sexuality. You might have heard that you're like born gay, or there's a gay gene, or I think there's an Avenue Q song reference to how being gay is in your DNA. But this all seems a bit confusing when you actually get into the science. So I've got 3 headlines, 2 from Nature and 1 from Science, all about kind of DNA markers on the X chromosome or genetic patterns linking into homosexuality, and then a study kind of contradicting both of these with no gay gene. And all of these use one of the biggest scientific techniques in the last 20 years, which has been genetic sequencing. And this is where you get the genetic material or the DNA of a plant, animal, human, whatever you like really. And you work out what exactly the code is. And then you link up sections of code or genes into their functions. Now this is super powerful. It's given us a lot of information about the way life works. But it's also powerful because it can tell us if there are differences between groups of people using like huge association studies. And it can link up differences between groups to their genetics, which is a pretty cool concept. But investigating these differences is quite difficult because it requires an awful lot of data, but it can also be pretty problematic when it comes to outcomes of the research. Here are some examples here. So I've got a headline saying, is there a gay gene? The problem with studies connecting genetics and LGBTQ identity. And kind of saying that the discovery of gay genes isn't a compelling reason to try looking for them, and that it won't fix the ongoing problems in the community. And I've also got a headline from the Daily Mail from 1993. It says, abortion hope after gay genes finding, which is a pretty heavy title to read to you. But most research, particularly in biology, it needs to have a real world application, particularly if you're kind of competing to get money to do your research. So whoever's done this research has had to think, what is the application of finding and identifying a gay gene? Now, this might have started with good intentions, such as giving credibility to LGBTQ+ identities. Kind of with the backing of science, maybe they'd be more accepted in society, or there would be less homophobia or something like this. But applications can kind of become more insidious. So DNA markers and things like that are a really good way of screening people. And this is really something we want to be doing when it comes to LGBTQ+ individuals. I mean, the Daily Mail clearly had an idea of what it wanted to do with those screening results, and I don't think that's something any of us actually want. And also, we know queer people exist. Why do we need to find the basis for it? Why can't we just accept that's what we are? That's, we're here. So why are we treating it like a new phenomenon? Why do we need to understand the basis for it? Because the fact is, it isn't a new phenomenon. We can look at the natural world for evidence of this. So I've got some stats here. To date, same-sex behaviour has been reported in over 450 species. You'll notice here I'm being really careful to say same-sex behaviour. And you might notice if I slip that later on the talk, I do mean same-sex behaviour. That's because we can't really claim that an animal has the same understanding of like sexuality or gender as a human does. So we can't kind of project homosexuality or bisexuality onto an animal. We also see sex changes naturally occurring in animals. So I've got fish to chickens. I didn't know chickens could change gender or change sex until I kind of did some research for all this. Very cool, want more people to know. And you also get intersex individuals in like different species as well. And we've been finding this for as long as we've been looking for it. So it's definitely not news because we've been doing this for an awful lot of time. So why do we treat it like it's a new thing? Well, that's something we're going to talk about in this. We see that just like in other fields, queer history gets erased or it gets deliberately obscured to try and hide it. Pretty famous example of exactly that. So Dr. George Murray Lovick, he was one of the scientists on Captain Scott's 1910 to 1913 expedition to the Antarctic. Now, they weren't supposed to be there that long, but they were. And that meant that he got to witness the entire breeding cycle of the Adelaide penguin. Pretty cool. That's not something anyone had researched before, not something anyone had witnessed before. So you can be thinking, oh yeah, what a cool thing to come home after my 3 years in the Antarctic and tell everyone about. Well, not in George's eyes. He noticed depraved sexual acts performed by these penguins, some of which I won't lie were pretty dark and I'm not going to talk about the details of. But others were simply just engaging in same-sex behaviour. But he was so horrified by this that he'd only write his notes about it in Greek so that others wouldn't be able to read it. And then he wouldn't allow these observations to be published, and other people wouldn't allow him to publish them anyway. Which is pretty wild when you've kind of just spent 3 years in the Antarctic and then you're not going to publish some of your results because you find them so depraved. And what outcome did hiding this do? Well, it was another 50 years until this behaviour was rediscovered. So not only are we losing evidence of same-sex behaviour in animals, but we're also making more work for ourselves. We're having to rediscover things, and I'm pretty sure nobody, willingly wants to spend that long in Antarctica just watching penguins. Although actually that does sound quite nice. So what about now? That was 1910. How are we reacting to gay animals now? Or same-sex behaviour in animals? Well, it's treated a bit differently. It's not hidden away, it's definitely celebrated. I've picked out a feel-good story about a bisexual goose in New Zealand. Also, the bisexual goose was blind. I got very deep into this during my research. It was very interesting. Good old Henry. But the treat is a novelty, kind of exciting, feel-good story. Now, I did some research. Turns out about 15 to 20% of geese engage in same-sex behaviour, according to a study in Nature. That's about 1 in 5. That's not exactly uncommon. So it's really interesting that we're surprised by these behaviours in animals, even though, you know, scientifically we know that they're not that rare. So you might be asking, why? Why are we so surprised by this? Well, I have a bit of an answer for you. It kind of goes against the status quo. So I quite like to think about science as like a staircase, and each new step is built on top of the one that became before it, and so on and so on, and it looks pretty sturdy. But if someone starts pointing out cracks and flaws in the early steps, you might not trust the later ones quite as much, and that's kind of the case here. So we're talking about Darwin's theory of evolution. I'm pretty sure most of you have heard of it. It basically says that creatures that are best adapted to their environment are the ones that will survive, and they'll go on to reproduce, and their traits and genes will be like given to their offspring to be inherited. But this relies on offspring, and LGBTQ plus individuals aren't necessarily going to have offspring to pass on their kind of gay gene to, all these traits. So that doesn't really make sense. If you've got this persisting and continued existence of an organism when it isn't actually passing on these genes. There's a bit of a conflict between this kind of Darwinian theory of evolution and LGBTQ plus individuals. I'm not saying the two totally oppose each other. There's actually quite a lot of studies going into like why evolutionary it might be useful to have like queer members of your population. But you can see why it could cause some uncomfortable questions for scientists if they're building their staircase of knowledge and they're kind of noticing bits don't match up so well at the bottom. Much nicer if we kind of started with a strong foundation with kind of all the pieces included rather than a slightly shaky one. So on that point, let's revisit my question about the lack of openly LGBTQ plus scientists. I want to start with like a little bit of hypothetical. If historically we had celebrated and included queer scientists, do you think there would be the same interest in the gay gene or same-sex behaviour in animals? I'm going to let you kind of let that percolate in your mind while I talk about the next bit. So there are specific societal pressures in pretty much every workplace that can make it uncomfortable to be out. But in my own experience of science, there can be like specific other factors. And one I think kind of links into this is that typically there's a separation between the scientist and the experiment. So if you're working in a clinical trial with people, you don't use people's names, you use like a code so that you know which individual you're talking about, but you don't know who that person is, you don't know any of their features. Or maybe you're working with another species, you can kind of separate yourself from it. It lets you kind of take your own biases and beliefs out of the experiment to a certain extent. And that can be really useful. But what happens if you're unable to separate yourself from the research subjects, either because you identify with them? You know, I identify as bisexual, so if I'm then doing a study on bisexual genes, I'm quite closely tied into it. Or if I'm studying and looking for a gay gene, how might having like a queer colleague or senior management or role models affect the way that I go about that research? I think it's really interesting because identity is absolutely key in the way you form questions. I might not be asking the same questions about a bisexual gene as someone that isn't bisexual might be asking. And the way you interpret the results of the studies as well can be really heavily influenced by your own kind of world beliefs. And then the way this gets kind of fed into society at large, I'm pretty sure there wasn't a queer person working at the Daily Mail when they put out that headline. And that really changes the way that people are receiving the news and kind of taking it with them and telling other people. So if you can't separate yourself and you have colleagues around you that also identify with the research, I just wonder how this sort of impacts research into these areas and their acceptance in society as a whole now. Obviously, we can't access this world, but we can play a part in changing the narrative now. So I want to introduce you to some LGBTQ plus scientists, both historical and slightly more contemporary. And I just want us to celebrate them for a moment. So I want to introduce you to Sarah. She was alive in the last century and identified as lesbian. and she was known for tracking down Typhoid Mary during the typhoid epidemic. But not only did she track down Mary Mallon once, she tracked her down twice because she went back to work. I think this is really interesting. I definitely recommend looking into Typhoid Mary because that's just a very interesting story and quite relevant for the times we're living in at the moment with isolating and things like this. But not only did Sarah work with typhoid, but she also worked with and advocated for immigrant communities in New York. And she started drawing attention to the role poverty plays in health, particularly children's health. And this is something we still struggle with doing at the moment. So it's really cool that she was doing this, back in the early 1900s. Next up, I want to talk to you about Alan. He was alive between 1890 and 1962, and after being assigned female at birth, he transitioned to living as a man. That included undergoing a hysterectomy, and he was one of the first men to kind of undergo one of these. And he also started hormonal therapy in 1920s, which is really cool because hormonal therapy only really became an option in the 1920s. So he was like really a pioneer here. But he didn't work in kind of gender reassignment. He worked at studying tuberculosis, and he developed a method of detecting disease involving like x-raying the chest. And that's been used to diagnose and potentially treat like thousands of patients. So that's like a really cool impact to be having. I just wanted to include this quote from him about his transition. It says, "Happier since I made this change than I ever have in my life, and I'll continue this way as long as I live." And I just love that. That just really resonates. And to be saying that back then, he had a really interesting life. He was outed later on in his life, and the way that he responded to that, I just really recommend looking into Alan and seeing his life. Here's a more contemporary and maybe familiar face. So Sally died quite recently, and upon her death, her long-term partner, 27 years, was revealed to be a woman, despite the fact she was married to a male astronaut earlier in her life. And she's particularly cool because she was the first American woman to go into space, and she was actually also the youngest person in space until last year's SpaceX flights. And I just think she's really cool because she's also one of the only LGBTQ plus people on US currency, which is quite nice. And actually, she kind of overcame a lot to be an astronaut. She faced a lot of pushback over her gender. So I think we've kind of heard, a lot of us will have heard that myth about, or maybe not a myth, but reports that NASA was asking a female astronaut how many tampons she needed to go on a 4-day mission. Well, Sally faced similar questions. She was asked whether or not space travel would affect her reproductive organs and things like this. So I think she's a pretty cool icon. I want to talk to you about Paul. He was a Hungarian mathematician and considered to be asexual. And he was the subject of a book called The Man Who Loved Only Numbers. And this seems to be true. He loved them so much that he spent like all his waking hours working with them. And that might explain why he had so many papers published. So 1,500 papers is a lot of work, a lot of maths. I've been working in science since I was like 18 and I only have 3. So he's doing very well for himself. He was actually so involved in the maths field that he's a bit like the Kevin Bacon of maths. So Kevin Bacon, you can kind of link anyone up to Kevin Bacon within about 6 degrees. So if someone's in this movie with him or with this person, they link up. Well, it's the same for Paul. You might have published a paper that has so-and-so as an author and so-and-so worked with so-and-so who worked with so-and-so who worked with Paul. So it all kind of links together. And there's so many other people that if I had all the time in the world, I would keep talking about them. But I'd actually like to kind of use a second to draw attention to contemporary LGBTQ plus scientists. So if you look at this website, LGBTQ plus in STEM, they have interviews with active scientists in the LGBTQ plus community. And I love reading through these and just seeing what people are up to and kind of seeing that we're being celebrated, we have a community. And I think it's so important that we celebrate people now. We don't wait until, they're dead and they're gone. We don't wait until we've realized that if we'd included the concept of LGBTQ plus earlier in our research, it might have been better. we should do it now. We should do it while these people are still actively working. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I've been Alex Holmes, and I hope I've left you wanting to know more about the secret lives of scientists.
So the answer to this question kind of ruins a couple films for me. So the first one is clownfish. I mentioned fish in the presentation, but usually there's like a matriarch of the group. So there's a woman fish that's kind of the main, runs the whole, runs the show. So in Finding Nemo, Marvin, Nemo's dad, would have actually transitioned to being female so that he could have mated with Nemo to produce more children. So yeah, that kind of ruins that show. And then also frogs in Jurassic Park. So the female dinosaurs were also able to become male dinosaurs and cause there to be an awful lot of dinosaurs. And obviously that is fiction. But it all comes down to like the DNA. It can kind of turn on and turn off different genes that allow them to either present as female or present as male. Because we all have pretty much the same genes, plus or minus a couple, depending on chromosomes. Whereas frogs have all of these, they can fine-tune exactly how they want to present. And it is usually about being able to reproduce. So if you're in a population that has too many males and too few females, or vice versa, that you can kind of adjust the numbers to keep your population going.
So we've got one more question. So do you know how did people treat these LGBTQ plus scientists? Did they face any criticisms?
Yeah, an awful lot of criticism. So I think one of the main famous examples here is Alan Turing. So he helped break the Enigma code back in the 1940s. And he was openly gay, and he was then arrested for this. He was chemically castrated and was just treated really, really horribly. And also, so Alan Hart, who I talked about in the presentation, he was outed as being transgender later in his life. And he's kind of, moved to a small community, he had a wife, he had a whole life. And then had to face kind of being exiled from this community because he'd been outed in the newspaper. And actually that quote I had was his response to this, kind of being, that I'm happy like this, I'm going to carry on like this, you can't bully me out of it. So both of those Alans, there's a picture of Alan examples, both of them pretty bravely stood up to these people. But I think it's actually quite rare because we're seeing them kind of survivor bias. These are the ones that were openly LGBTQ+, and we're the ones that we're hearing about. But how many people, were open and then had to go back into the closet because of safety fears? Like how many people then left science because the way they were being treated? That's something we'll never really know. So I think there's an awful lot more people that we'll simply never know about just because they were never able to be open about who they were.
Just going back to animals that transition, has a lot of research been done into what triggers it? I mean, I wouldn't imagine it's a conscious choice. So what makes it happen?
That's a really good question. I think there's kind of two parts to it. So there's the mechanism of how it happens, on a cellular basis, how do you go from male to female to male, and kind of you can trigger that with chemicals and things. So in a lab, you can sit down and you can add chemicals to cells and they will change. But in an environment or the natural world, you're not having scientists going around and kind of betting chemicals onto frogs. That's why I hope that's not happening. So yeah, there is this kind of, okay, we know there must be environmental factors. There must be a way of knowing the balance of males to females in a group. But yeah, they're not entirely sure how to tell how the animals are knowing that this is happening, or if they are knowing, or if there's just a change is happening but they're not conscious of it. It's one of those difficult things as well, because the second you take them out of their environment and go put them in a study environment, you might be losing something. So it's a very complicated way of working it out, really. But yeah, I would be really keen to find out what and how and why.
Yeah, I mean, it conjures up this almost ridiculous picture of somebody going, well, that many females, that many males, so you, and you, you're going to change. You know, but obviously that can't happen. So it's really quite interesting.
It really is. I'm hoping that I'll find out and we can have like a really nice David Attenborough documentary about it, because yeah, I'm really curious to know. And there's so many ways that environment does kind of then trigger genetic changes, or less genetic changes, but kind of turning on and off genes, or like upregulating, downregulating. And I don't think we're entirely certain of how these things change, other than we just see a correlation between environmental changes and genetic changes. Yeah, it's like a huge area.
So that brings us to the end of our talks for this evening. I'd like to thank all of our speakers once again for joining us and sharing their research with us and their presentations. I hope you've all found it as fascinating as I have. Obviously, we have taken part in this event as part of LGBTQ+ History Month. And as part of that, we do also have a few more events coming up within Suffolk Archives. For example, next weekend we have our escape rooms, and at the end of the month we have our Be Your True Self Lates event. As you may have noticed on the way in, we have also opened our brand new exhibition this evening. It's called Women Don't Do Such Things, and you are more than welcome to, as you leave, have a wander around and check out that for yourself. The shop is also open until 9 o'clock, and you will be able to find the Pride in Suffolk's Past book that we produced for the exhibition and the project last year, as well as a few other bits and pieces. There is a survey on your way out. It was a feedback form if you would like to fill that out, or the QR code here is the As in the Past survey form as well. Thank you all for joining us in person and online. It's been great to see you all, and I hope to see you all again soon. So thank you.